this call, just so you have a sense of where we're going next. This presentation is going to take me about 20 minutes to get through, and then we're going to go into smaller breakout rooms to really process it. So I've called it Coronavirus and Our Freedom Dreams, how youth organizers can understand the current crisis and seize the opportunities that it creates. And I have three main goals, what I hope to accomplish with this presentation. The first one is to apply an analysis of racial capitalism and neoliberalism to better understand the conditions that were already impacting working class young people of color. So before the crisis even hit, what were we already dealing with and where did that come from? If the terms racial capitalism and neoliberalism are confusing to you, don't worry, I'm gonna offer some definitions. The second goal is to understand how the crisis creates opportunities to advance radical demands for change, as well as be aware of the dangers for even more oppressive conditions. And I also hope to offer a framework for how we can think about how we can use crisis to advance radical demands in this moment. So to start off, let me offer a definition of racial capitalism. This might be a new concept for some of y'all. So what we mean by racial capitalism is a system that we live under that is built around race and class, always working inextricable from one another, reliant on one another. So in this system, wealthy people who are overwhelmingly white gain wealth, profit, and power from the exploitation and oppression of working class and poor people of all colors. But racial inequality is built into the structure of the economy itself. And race and class are always working together to shape policies and cultural norms. So the idea with this framework of racial capitalism is we can't understand capitalism without understanding that it is a racialized system, a system that relies on race and racism to reproduce itself. And we can't understand race separate from the role that it plays in reproducing the exploitative economy that capitalism is. So this is really important because it's important for us to understand that the DNA of the American political economy is and always has been based on exploitation and oppression. And so in addition to being racialized, we understand that capitalism as a system relies on structural sexism or patriarchy to reproduce itself as well. And that the most recent stage of development of this racialized capitalism in the US and around the world is what we refer to as neoliberalism. Or we can think of this as the successful advancement over the last 40 years of the agenda of the 1%. So the neoliberalism has kind of three core components that if you understand these three things, you basically understand the gist of what neoliberalism is. So I'm going to go through these and talk about to help us kind of ground how this economic and political system of neoliberalism has impacted our communities. So the first core element of neoliberalism is the consolidation and elevation of corporate power. So this means globalization, tearing down trade protections to make it easier for corporations to set up shop in other parts of the world, particularly the global South, where Black and brown people are pushed out of ancestral lands, pushed out of their communities, and forced to work in factories, often under terrible conditions, as well as closing down factories and taking away good paying jobs for the working class here in the US. It means deregulation, so dismantling government policies that are put in place to keep corporations in check. It means privatization, taking things that are in the public good, taking them out of the realm of the public and making them something that corporations can make money off of. And it means attacking workers' rights, unions, the institutions that working people rely on to try to maintain power and protect their interests in the face of dominant corporations. So that's the first major element of neoliberalism. It's the advancement of corporate power. The second core component is attacks on the public sector. This basically means cutbacks to everything that poor and working people rely on. So cuts to funding for public schools, cuts to public housing, cuts to food stamps, cuts to the total dismantling of welfare back in the 90s. So all of these things that had been put in place to protect people from the worst ravages of poverty, cutting back on those essential social service programs and making people more vulnerable to this unpredictable and crisis-prone economy that we live in. The third core element is crackdowns. So if you're cutting back on the services that people need, you're taking away taking away people's jobs. They don't have a viable means for living their lives and producing for their families. What do you do instead? And so what we see is the rise of mass incarceration and policing. We see the further militarization of the immigration forces, increases in deportation. So basically, in a situation where the economy is not set up to take care of people, an increased reliance on state violence as a means to keep people in check. So where they cut back on all the social services, we actually see an increase in militarization of our communities and militarization of the global order. So this is always operating both domestically and abroad. So if someone asks you what neoliberalism is, in a nutshell, you can tell them it means it's about corporate power, it's about cutbacks, and it's about crackdowns. So this is the agenda that has been operating and harming our communities for several decades now. And the 1% has had multiple strategies that they have effectively used to advance this agenda. And I'm just going to touch on 3 of them that are particularly relevant for the conversation that we want to have today. So the first one is to understand that our enemies have been very good about advancing their agenda through the realm of big ideas. So they're not talking about the minutia of particular policies. They're talking about rugged individualism, that everybody can get ahead if you work hard to pick yourself up by the bootstraps. Talking about the free market and how it fixes everything, and we just need to get government out of the way because it's wasteful and inefficient. And unions are bad for the economy and bad for workers. And most importantly, the biggest idea of all is the strategic use of racism. So coming out of the Black freedom struggle and the people's movements of the 60s and 70s, were kind of overt Jim Crow racism and bigotry is no longer acceptable. Our opposition has gotten really good at using race in more covert ways, to the point now where it's not even covert, it's out in the open again. But for a long term, the strategic use of racism is both a way to keep people of color down, as well as consolidate a political bloc that could advance their agenda. And so race was really essential to building what we can call a white united front. So the 1% understood that they couldn't advance their interests if they were just organizing millionaires and billionaires. So racism, sexism, homophobia were strategically used to build a coalition, a multi-class white coalition between the 1%, the Christian right movements, and the white nationalist movements in this country into a consolidated political bloc that has proven to be pretty durable and very powerful at advancing their policy agenda. The second major strategy that they've used is the use of crisis, and that's really the crux of what we're going to be talking about today. And so one of the architects of neoliberalism, Sky Milton Friedman, had this to say about crisis. You're going to see this quote again in the video clip I'm about to show, but just to make sure we're kind of reading it and rereading it to understand how important it is. He said that only a crisis, actual or perceived, produces real change. I believe our basic function is to develop alternatives to existing policies, to keep them alive, until the politically impossible becomes the politically inevitable. So the idea is that crisis creates opportunities where the things that you wanted to do, the radical ideas that had no chance of getting by, suddenly become possible, suddenly become the thing that people want more than anything. And those are the opportunities to advance what we call structural reforms. And this is the third major strategy that they've been very effective at. So the idea is to think about policies that you put forward that actually change the rules of the game. In the case of privatization, kind of the major structural reform, changing the rules that make it easier for private companies and for-profit institutions to take on services that were typically paid for or covered by the government. And starting by reforming smaller services, things that people aren't really paying attention to and don't really care that much about as long as they get done. So things like trash collection, things like parking lots. And as you do that, you start to set the precedent for, in this case, privatization, till we get to the point where they start going after schools, the rise of charter schools, the privatization of prisons, the privatization of utilities, till we get to the place where we are now, where everything's on the table, even things that are extremely popular programs like Social Security. 30 years ago, the idea of privatizing Social Security would have been laughable. And today it's something that is offered even by some Democrats. So, moving this agenda has meant that we have seen a radical increase in the wealth and concentration of wealth in the hands of the 1% to the detriment of our people and our communities. And we have to understand that what this represents is an all-out class warfare against working people, as they have worked to consolidate wealth and power in their hands. And they have moved not just an economic agenda, but they have moved a racial agenda to reinforce their position in the society. And this process over the course of the last 30, 40, 50 years creates the conditions for what we're experiencing today with the coronavirus. Capitalism as an economic and political system is inherently prone to crisis. It goes through waves of crisis. And what this system of neoliberalism has done is made our communities particularly vulnerable. Because of those cutbacks, because of the lack of a good, strong economy, when we get hit with something that's unforeseen like a coronavirus, we know that our people are the ones that are most likely to suffer that pain. But while the 1% agenda creates the conditions for the coronavirus, we are also have the opportunity to influence what the long-term economic and political consequences of this crisis are, if we have a good orientation and if we're ready to act. So with that, I'm going to show a little video. It's about 8 minutes long that kind of reinforces this understanding of how crisis creates both strategic opportunities as well as dangers and threats that we need to be prepared for. Maria, give me a thumbs up if you hear the audio once it starts going.
Ideas that are lying around. Friedman, one of history's most extreme free market economists, was wrong about a whole lot, but he was right about that. In times of crisis, seemingly impossible ideas suddenly become possible. But whose ideas? Sensible, fair ones, designed to keep as many people as possible safe, secure, and healthy? Or predatory ideas, designed to further enrich the already unimaginably wealthy while leaving the most vulnerable further exposed? The world economy is seizing up in the face of cascading shocks.
COVID-19 can be characterized as a pandemic.
In the wake of the coronavirus crisis, stocks have stopped trading on Wall Street after a 7% drop.
This is a historical day, the biggest drop we've seen since that crash in 1987.
The drop was spurred by a growing oil price war as the market was already weakened by coronavirus fears.
Yeah, no, I don't take responsibility at all.
In the midst of this widespread panic, corporate lobbyists of all stripes are, of course, dusting off all the ideas they had lying around. Trump is pushing a suspension of the payroll tax.
Oh, sorry.
which could bankrupt Social Security, providing the excuse to cut it or privatize it completely. An idea that has been lying around for a very long time.
A worker at his or her option ought to be allowed to put some of their own money in a private savings account.
Lying around on both sides of the aisle.
When I argued that we should freeze federal spending, I meant Social Security as well. I meant Medicare and Medicaid.
And then there are the ideas being floated to bail out some of the wealthiest and most polluting sectors in our economy.
We are working very closely with the cruise line industry, likewise with the airline industry. They're two great industries, and we'll be helping them through this patch.
Bailouts for fracking companies, not to mention cruise ships, airlines, and hotels, handouts which Trump could benefit from personally. Which is a big problem because the virus isn't the only crisis we face. There's also climate disruption, and these industries that are getting rescued with our money are the ones driving it. Trump has also been meeting with the private health insurers.
We're meeting with the top executives of the health insurance companies.
The very ones who have made sure that so many Americans can't afford the care they need. And what are the chances they don't have their hands out? It seems like the whole pandemic is getting outsourced.
Well, Mr. President, thank you for inviting us here today, along with our colleagues from Walmart and Walgreens and our partners at CVS. Normally, you'd view us as competitors, but today we're focused on a common competitor, and that's defeating the spread of the coronavirus.
The Fed's first move was to pump $1.5 trillion into the financial markets, with more undoubtedly on the way. But if you're a worker, especially a gig worker, there's a very good chance you're out of luck. If you do need to see a doctor for care, there's a good chance no one's going to help you pay if you aren't covered. And if you want to heed the public health warnings to stay home from work, there's also a chance that you won't get paid. Of course, you still need to pay your rent and all of your debts, medical, student credit card, mortgage. The results are predictable. Too many sick people have no choice but to go to work, which means more people contracting and spreading the virus. And without comprehensive bailouts for workers, we can expect more bankruptcies and more homelessness down the road. Look, we know this script. In 2008, the last time we had a global financial meltdown, the same kinds of bad ideas for no strings attached corporate bailouts carried the day. And regular people around the world paid the price. And even that was entirely predictable. 13 years ago, I wrote a book called The Shock Doctrine, The Rise of Disaster Capitalism. It described a brutal and recurring tactic by right-wing governments. After a shocking event, a war, coup, terrorist attack, market crash, or natural disaster, they exploit the public's disorientation, suspend democracy, push through radical free market policies that enrich the 1% at the expense of the poor and middle class. But here is what my research has taught me. Shocks and crises don't always go the shock doctrine path. In fact, it's possible for crisis to catalyze a kind of evolutionary leap. Think of the 1930s, when the Great Depression led to the New Deal.
The only thing we have to fear is fear itself.
In the United States and elsewhere, governments began to weave a social safety net, so that the next time there was a crash, there would be programs like Social Security to catch people.
The right of every family to a decent home. The right to adequate medical care, and the opportunity to achieve and enjoy good health.
Look, we know what Trump's plan is. A pandemic shock doctrine featuring all the most dangerous ideas lying around. From privatizing Social Security, to locking down borders, to caging even more migrants. Hell, he might even try canceling elections. But the end of this story hasn't been written yet. It is an election year, and social movements and insurgent politicians are already mobilized. And like in the 1930s, we have a whole bunch of other ideas lying around.
Do we believe that everybody should be entitled as a right to health care?
Yeah! We will not stop
organizing and fighting until all unhoused folks who want shelter have shelter.
Canceling student debt.
It makes so much sense that if you're sick, that you should not be penalized where you don't have an income.
Many of these ideas were dismissed as too radical just a week ago. Now, they're starting to seem like the only reasonable path to get out of this crisis and prevent future ones.
Now, here's something that helps explain the difference between the testing situation in South Korea and the U.S. The South Korea, like European countries and Canada, has universal single-payer insurance, and that means that it's easier to mobilize, and also people know what to do. There is pretty much one answer for how to get testing. The U.S. is a patchwork of countless different systems, and so you can't say, here's exactly the steps that every American should take in order to get tested.
And with Washington suddenly in the giant stimulus business, this is precisely the time for the stimulus that many of us have been talking about for years.
Today is the day that we truly embark on a comprehensive agenda of economic, social, and racial justice in the United States of America.
It's called the Green New Deal. Instead of rescuing the dirty industries of the last century, we should be boosting the clean ones that will lead us into safety in the coming century. If there is one thing history teaches us, it's that moments of shock are profoundly volatile. We either lose a whole lot of ground, get fleeced by elites, and pay the price for decades, or we win progressive victories that seemed impossible just a few weeks earlier. This is no time to lose our nerve. The future will be determined by whoever is willing to fight harder for the ideas they have lying around.
So we know that which way things go on the back end of this crisis or any crisis in large part has to do with how well our people are organized, how well our movements are able to mobilize. And we understand that the political leadership of working class young people of color is particularly critical. We know that young people of color often are the best freedom dreamers. They have the most radical imaginations. They have the most to gain from a transformation of the system. And there are many reasons why they are poised to play a critical leadership role in an intergenerational movement that can actually transform conditions. So what I want to do now is just offer a framework for what kinds of fights, what kinds of organizing should we be thinking about as we move through this coronavirus crisis. So if we think about this within the framework of from crisis to liberation, and what we're called on is now is the time to make structural demands that attack the very root of racial capitalism itself. This is a time for us to uplift liberatory narratives that really paint the picture of the world that we're trying to build. And we know that we're going to have to build our bases at scale. So we need campaigns that are going to bring, excite and mobilize our people by the millions, and are going to resonate with people outside of our communities. So we have to form those longer term strategic alliances that can give us the political force to win the transformative policies that we know that we need.